Hi, this is Videos from the Ville. This is Dr. Greenewalt, Dr. Charles Greenewalt, and I am offering this video on behalf of Government 111, Government 112, excuse me. It's Introduction to State and Local Government. Happy to have all of you with me. We've gone over the syllabus and the requirements. Let's go ahead and tackle the first section and the first section of PowerPoints. Okay. The one thing I want all of you to think about and realize is the impact of government and politics on our day-to-day lives. We tend to minimize this or not realize the effect, the full effect that government and politics has on our lives. I used to sit at the dinner table with my children and challenge them to think of anything that they did during the course of the day that politics and government didn't directly or indirectly affect. And if they could think of anything, I'd give them $1. And I was going to do that with you if we were in a face-to-face setting. Since we're not, we'll just have to ask you to think about it. I would normally have such answers as, blinking. Dr. Greenewalt, blinking's not political, and politics and government doesn't affect me blinking. But in fact, I can show you that it does. Why do we blink? We blink due to particulate matter in the air. And particulate matter in the air, the amount of it is determined by rules and regulations of the government. You could say daydreaming. Daydreaming is not affected by government and politics. But of course, what do we daydream about? We daydream about what we have seen on television or the movies, what we have read, what we've heard on radio or in recordings. And all of that is regulated to some degree by the government. So daydreaming is largely affected by government and politics as well. You could say sleeping, for example. Well, sleeping. It is illegal to sleep on the park benches in Central Park. It is illegal to sleep in the train station in Harrisburg. It is illegal to sleep, as I found out, in the train station in Basel, Switzerland. While I was studying German in 1980 in Germany, on a weekend I took a trip to Switzerland, and I was going back to Mannheim for Monday morning classes, and I arrived at Basel at midnight, and my train left for Mannheim at 5 a.m. So it didn't make much sense to get a hotel for 5 hours, so I simply sat down on the steps of the train station and set my wristwatch alarm and rested my head on the granite wall, and I dozed off. Next thing I knew, I was nudged by a nightstick of a tall Swiss policeman who informed me in German that kein Schlafen hier, no sleeping here. And I said, ich nur eine arme Studentin, I'm only a poor student. And ich habe kein Geld, I don't have any money. So he politely informed me that there was no sleeping allowed in the train station, and I'm welcome to continue to stay there, but I needed to be alert and awake. So that the government was involved with sleeping in that particular instance. So you might think of some other examples, and I'd be happy to talk to you about them at some point when we meet, or if you want to email me, or when we talk on the phone. But this takes us to the textbook. Of course, the textbook tries to show you all the different ways in which politics and government influences our life. And as we try to direct government and we try to affect change in the future where we think it might be necessary, you have to know the organization of government, how is government structured, and you have to know the procedures by which government operates. And we're going to do all of that with state and local government in this semester. And I look forward to doing this with all of you. Now, a place to start would be, what is the basic premise that underlies all of political science? Well, it doesn't underlie just political science, but economics as well. Economics and political science are one and the same. The academy artificially separates them, but they're really one and the same. Because what is politics all about? The distribution of societal resources. What is economics all about? The distribution of societal resources. And what is the premise that underlies, the maxim that underlies both disciplines? There's one thing I want you to take from the course. It's this. Remember this and use this in your thinking about government and public policy in the future. What are human desires? When we think of what we want and what we'd like to have, we have to realize that human desires are limitless, aren't they? No matter how much we have of something, we always want more. Human desires are limitless or infinite, but societal resources are what? Societal resources are limited and finite. So we have to keep this lesson foremost in our mind, particularly at this point in public policy in the world and in the United States and in Pennsylvania. It will hold our policymakers in good stead. Well, what is politics? You find that there are as many different definitions of politics as there are political scientists, but we find that there's always two great questions about politics: who governs and to what end do they govern? You find that one of the best definitions of politics, and one of the easiest to remember, is given to us by Hans Morgenthau. Hans Morgenthau was from a German Jewish family that left Nazi Germany just as the door swung shut. They came to the United States, and Hans Morgenthau developed at the University of Chicago into one of the greatest international relations theorists the world has ever seen. He wrote a great book called Politics Among Nations, and one of my professors at the University of Virginia just happened to be his graduate student assistant when he wrote Politics Among Nations. So when Hans passed away a few years ago, he stepped up to the plate and he asked his widow if she would mind if he would go ahead and update the volume, and she said fine. So Politics Among Nations is still being used in classrooms today, but since that time he is my professor has passed on as well, so I don't know how much longer Politics Among Nations will be used as a current text in IR, in international relations, but it's still one of the best books that you can find. Well, how does he define politics? He simply defines politics as the struggle for power. The struggle for power, pure and simple. Look at the last gubernatorial elections here in Pennsylvania. The candidates were struggling for power between Tom Corbett, the incumbent, and Governor Wolf. Or you can look at the presidential elections that are in full swing. It is simply the struggle for power, in this case between President Trump and the Democratic candidate Joe Biden. Well, what are some other definitions of politics? Another individual from a German Jewish family that escaped Nazi Germany just in time was Karl Deutsch, D-E-U-T-S-C-H. D-E-U-T-S-C-H. Karl Deutsch went on to become a great political scientist at Columbia University, and he has passed as well. And he's written some of the best general books that we have for introductory political science. Karl Deutsch defined politics as, quote, the making of decisions by public means. The making of decisions by public means, in contrast to the making of personal decisions privately by individuals. So again, he defines politics as the making of decisions by public means, in contrast to the making of personal decisions privately by individuals. Third individual that we could point out, he's still with us, thank goodness, and is a very active of the American Association of Political Science, is Max Skidmore. Max Skidmore defines politics for us as the means by which human beings collectively organize their affairs. The means by which human beings collectively organize their affairs. Next, we could turn to a British political scientist, perhaps the greatest British political scientist of the 20th century. His name is Harold Lasswell. Harold Lasswell was much like Henry Kissinger. He was a great professor and a great theoretician. Kissinger, however, made the transition from Harvard University into the Nixon and Ford administrations, and was a very one of the most effective national security affairs advisors and secretaries of state we've ever had. Harold Lasswell was brought into the conservative government in the mid-1960s in the United Kingdom and didn't make the transition well between the academy and between the real world of politics, but that was fine. He went back to teaching and research, and the students in the United Kingdom and the realm of political science is the better for it. But what did Harold Lasswell, how did he define politics? Harold Lasswell defined politics as a answer to several questions. He said, we define politics when we answer these questions. And those questions are, who gets what? When do they get it? How much do they get? And in what manner will they receive it? So who gets what? When do they receive it? How much do they receive? And in what manner will it be received? So those are the four primary questions of politics, he believes. And by showing us this particular answer, he is doing what? He is simply showing us the connection between economics and political science, showing us the linkage there. Who gets what? How much do they get? When do they get it? And in what fashion do they receive it? Well, we could go on next to perhaps the greatest political scientist of the 20th and perhaps the 21st century so far. He is perhaps not only the greatest political scientist, but there are many people who believe he's the greatest social scientist. James Q. Wilson, much of our material that we will use this semester in state and local government is based upon his thinking and based upon his earlier work. James Q. Wilson was the chairman of the government department at Harvard and had established a great reputation for himself. Eventually, there are officials from the University of Southern California who came and tried to hire him away. And he said, well, I'm at the top of my profession. Harvard University is regarded as the best university in the world. I'm the chairman of the political science department here at Harvard. What else could I want? And they put their checkbook on the desk and said, quote us a number. And he thought they were kidding. And when he gave them an outlandish number, they wrote a check, and he left Harvard University. He just unfortunately passed away about 3 years ago now. He was a giant theorist and a giant scholar, and we all miss him very much. But how did James Q. Wilson define politics? He defined politics as how people or elites claiming to speak for the people define the public interest. How people or elites claiming to speak for the people define the public interest. Now, he will argue who gets what is only part of the story. The who gets what coming out of Lasswell's definition. Lasswell would respond that a broad interpretation of who gets what would include the answer to Wilson's question of how people or elites claiming to speak for the people define the public interest. But interestingly enough, in James Q. Wilson's definition is a very serious question, and that is the public interest. What is the public interest? We will hear during this presidential election the candidates talk about the public interest all the time. We hear this in many elections at all different levels of government, particularly in state and local politics, that they are all running to improve the public interest. Interestingly enough, you'll find that no one defines what the public interest is. Well, you find that this has been a question in political science for many, many generations. There was one individual, however, who tackled this subject and did a good job with it, and that individual's name was Walter Lippmann. Walter Lippmann was, again, one of the greatest political pundits and political theorists of the 20th century. He advised every president from Woodrow Wilson to Lyndon Baines Johnson, from World War I until the Vietnam War. And in 1955, Walter Lippmann wrote a wonderful little book called The Public Philosophy. And I picked up a used copy of that in Charlottesville when I was in graduate school in the late 1970s. And one very rainy weekend, I was reading The Public Philosophy, and I chanced upon his definition of the public interest. I want to share it with you and see what you think of it. But it's the best definition I've ever found, and I think that I would like you to remember it and use it in the future. Walter Lippmann tells us that the public interest, quote, may be presumed to be what men would choose if they saw clearly, they thought rationally, they acted disinterestedly, and benevolently. So the public interest is what man would choose if they saw clearly, thought rationally, acted disinterestedly, and benevolently. That's a tall order to ask any man to do all of those things. But when we see that happening, indeed, that would represent the public interest. But his definition brings another question to mind. This is perhaps one of the major questions in philosophy, and some of you may be philosophy majors and have dealt with it there. But the question then becomes, what is a rational man? What is a rational man? Well, he doesn't leave us in the lurch. He, again, will give us one suggestion, give us one definition to work with. He believes that a rational person or a rational man is, quote, one who decides where he will strike a balance between what he desires and what can be done, end of quote. So a rational person is one who can decide where they will strike a balance between what they desire and what can be done. So this is someone who recognizes what they want out of life and recognizing that their desires are limitless, but also realizing that he or she can't have everything they want. And so what is possible? What do I want and what is possible, and to try to strike a balance between them. Again, this leads us right back to that basic premise of political science and of economics, that human desires are limitless and societal resources are limited. Well, there are a couple other terms in this first section that I'd like you to be familiar with and like you to look at in your textbook. One is power. What is power? Well, power is nothing more than the ability of one person to have another act in accordance with their wishes. It's all the ability that a person has to have others act in accordance with their wishes. Now, there's one famous American political scientist by the name of Grover Starling, Starling, Grover Starling's first teaching assignment in the aftermath of graduate school was Millersville University. Grover had attended West Point. He was on the track team and on the football team. He served his time, fulfilled his obligation to the services, then went to the University of Michigan, got his PhD, and his first teaching assignment was here at Millersville to replace Professor Tannehill, who was on sabbatical. Well, I was fortunate enough actually to have him for Scope and Methods, and he was one of the finest professors I ever had. But Grover tells us what the sources of power might be. And he says there are 8 possible sources of power. The 8 possible sources of power, let me name them, and then we'll go back and define them and discuss each one for just a second. Coercive power is the type of power that we're most familiar with, isn't it? Coercive power is the ability of a leader to threaten punishment and to deliver penalties. Coercive power, well, let me just go through, as I said, and name them all. Coercive power, connection power, expert power, dependence power, obligation power, legitimate power, reward power, and referent power. Well, coercive power is the type of power that we most traditionally associate with the term. As I said a moment ago, it's the coercive power is nothing more than the ability of a leader to threaten and deliver punishment to their followers. The power of coercive, I should say the strength of coercive power will depend upon the followers, their what are the probabilities that the leader will deliver those punishments, and what are the punishments. That will determine the strength of coercive power. Connection power is who do you know? Who are the individuals that you might know or associate with in government that might be able to provide you leverage or power yourself in a future public policy discussion. There's expert power. This is power that an individual has because he or she has special knowledge or skill or ability in an area. This is the kind of power that Henry Kissinger has when any time there is any kind of international relations upheaval or brouhaha, you always find ABC, NBC, CBS, Fox News, CNN, C-SPAN. They all eventually beat a path to Henry Kissinger's door, even though he's in his mid-90s now, and ask him what he thinks, because he has a special knowledge of international relations, of East-West relations, of Sino-Soviet relations, of arms limitations, and of the Middle East that not many individuals have ever had. Dependence power. Dependence power is what feudal society was based on in medieval Europe. Dependence power is the followers are, a group of people are dependent upon a leader for protection. And this would have been, for example, in medieval society, where the serfs would give 10% of their crops to a local warlord, and in return, if there are marauders from outside the area that are coming in the area and going to attack the serfs' homes, that the serfs can take refuge within the warlord's castle, he will give them protection and will try to protect their homes and protect their children and their wives. In return, all they have to do is give 10% of their crops to the warlord, so they depend upon one another. Obligation power, the best way I can describe this would be you scratch my back, I'll scratch yours. That's obligation power. Find that this used to be called log rolling. If you're ever reading older materials in the field of political science and you see the term log rolling, they're talking about obligation power. Legitimate power is another form of power, and that's just the power that an individual has because they hold a certain office. Then we have reward power. Reward power is the power that a leader has to give special recognition, a promotion, a raise to an individual for service that they have rendered. Reward power. And lastly, we have referent power, R-E-F-E-R-E-N-T, referent power. Another term for this is charisma. Charisma. Somewhat like the Supreme Court in the mid-1960s said that they couldn't define pornography, but they knew it when they saw it. Well, the same thing is true of charisma. It's very hard to define, but we know it when we see it. Charisma is just the ability that a leader has to have others identify with them. Referent power would be, it could be seen. There was a leader, a national leader of the Episcopal Church, who during the administration of Teddy Roosevelt went to the White House to visit the president. He had been there before, had visited other presidents before. A friend went with and waited in the lobby for him, and when the meeting was over, they walked out into the streets of Washington. And as they walked, the minister was quiet, and his friend finally asked him, well, how was your meeting with President Teddy Roosevelt? How was your meeting with President Roosevelt? And his minister colleague looked at him and he said, you don't understand. You do not understand. The world is different now. The sun will shine more brightly. The stars will orbit in a different arc. He said, the world will never be the same. I have seen Roosevelt. That is an incredible amount of charisma. And Teddy very well may have been the most charismatic president we've ever had outside, for example, maybe George Washington. There are other contenders there as well, whether it be Ronald Reagan or John Kennedy or Franklin Roosevelt. We've been blessed with a number of charismatic presidents and governors, such as William Scranton II, or Bill Scranton, who served as governor in the early 1960s and then sought the Republican nomination for the presidency in 1964, but fell just a little bit short to Barry Goldwater of Arizona. Well, what are some of the other terms that we should take a look at? Well, we also need to know what authority is. Authority is nothing more than the right to use power. What is formal authority? Formal authority is the right to exercise power that's vested in a government office. So authority is the right to use power. Formal authority is the right to exercise power that's given to a government office. Then we have influence. Influence is a more subtle term than power. When you're talking about influence, you see that individuals have maintained their free will. This is a sort of an extreme example that I like to provide. But when I was teaching at Lake Superior State University in the early 1980s, boxing was still a very large sport in America, very celebrated sport. And most all of us knew all the champions of the different weight categories. Well, right out of the Olympics, last Olympics, and this would have been in the spring of 1982, We find that there was a new sports hero in the United States, and he won the gold medal in boxing in his weight category at the Olympics, and he went into pro boxing upon return to the United States, and he became the world champion in no time at all. He was born to a African American family that lived between Washington, D.C. and Baltimore. He was clean cut. He was articulate. He was he became a sports hero to many people, and of course that person's name is Sugar Ray Leonard. Sugar Ray won the welterweight title without any trouble and thought, I need a new challenge. So I think I'm going to go up and try to win the middleweight title. Well, the middleweight champion was Tommy, the Hitman Hearns from Detroit. Tommy had a record of 21 wins and no losses, and all of his fights were won by knockout except one. And so all of a sudden Sugar Ray Leonard is going to go up against him. Well, they did eventually fight. Fight was televised by ABC, and Howard Cosell was one of the announcers. I remember watching it. Sugar Ray is battered pretty badly at the very beginning of the fight, but he dances his way out of it. He boxes very well, and he's wearing down Tommy the Hitman Hearns. Eventually, he hits Tommy Hearns so hard that Tommy Hearns flies through the ropes on the ring into the audience and lands in the lap of one of the spectators. You see, this was a great example of power. You find that Sugar Ray used power, and he didn't try to influence him. Tommy the Hitman Hearns had no free will in this transaction. And so that's an extreme example of the difference between influence and power, but I think you get the point. Another concept is legitimacy. What makes any government legitimate? Well, what makes any government legitimate is consent of the governed. So long as that government has consent of the governed, then it is legitimate. You see that this was the element that was missing in all the Eastern European countries that were set up, all the Eastern European governments that were set up in the aftermath of the Second World War. The Red Army, the Soviet Army, had occupied Eastern Europe, and after the Second World War, they simply set up the governments that they wanted, all communist governments, all Marxist, Leninist governments. You had one, of course, in East Germany, in Poland, in Hungary, in Czechoslovakia, in Romania, in Bulgaria, and Albania. And we find that the people, for the most part, certainly didn't want those governments. And after the Berlin Wall fell under President Bush in 1989, through the efforts of the Soviet leader, Gorbachev, and the efforts of President Reagan earlier and President Bush Sr., the wall came down, and the Red Army was withdrawn from those countries. And as soon as the Red Army was withdrawn, all of those governments fell and were replaced. None of them were legitimate. And that brings us to the end of this first presentation. We're going to take a break here, and we're going to go on to the next video. The next video would be on the types of political systems that we can see across the world. When our founding fathers came to the New World and set up our colonies, they had a choice of what kind of governments were they going to establish. And it was largely based on what they had seen in the Old World. So let's take a break and come back and talk about all the different types of world political systems that there are. Okay, be right back.